Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. We are moving along swiftly here. We're on Chapter 23, The Great Depression and the New Deal. Lots and lots of interesting things as we lead our way into World War II. Alright, so the intended audience for this post are girls and women who are unemployed and willing to work as domestic servants. Says if you want a good job in household employment, apply a right to Illinois State Employment Service, so Illinois, obviously. The lady appears to happy to have a job. It tells women that they will be paid, fed, and provided with good working conditions. This young woman appears to appreciate the opportunity the Illinois State Employment Service has provided. While he may not have been able to provide immediate economic comfort and security to all Americans, he could provide the spirit of the people through work and other relief programs, which in turn had the potential for improving consumer confidence and getting the economy moving again. And when we say he, we're talking FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All right. So let's start at the beginning of this. So Herbert Hoover runs for election in 1928. He wins. And he has kind of a different philosophy than a lot of presidents that come after him. He basically has the philosophy of the presidents who came before him. He follows two American traditions. Economic outcomes were the product of individual character, and through voluntary action, business could regulate itself. Encouraged Americans to remain confident. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation cautiously provided federal loans to railroads and banks. As far as his failures go, he's got a very stubborn adherence to the gold standard, which is going to add to length and severity of the Depression. You have the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which further hinders global trade and leads to greater economic contraction. Reluctant to break with tradition of limited government. So he wants to stay with that laissez-faire idea where government is not as involved in people's everyday lives and that kind of stuff. Private charity could not handle massive amounts of unemployment. It's perceived by Americans as insensitive, even though he had done more than previous presidents in times of economic need. Hoover is often very misunderstood. He really went with the old ideas. He was a very traditional person as far as his beliefs in government and what government was supposed to do. And even including the progressive presidents, there was some things that were hands off. There were things that they did not get involved in, and people's everyday lives is one of those things that just presidents and government didn't get involved with. And so Hoover just was not the person to step away from those ideals. And it does take a big change in our government for that to happen. All right, so Hooverville. So the public's going to connect Hoover's names to the shanty towns erected by the homeless in urban areas. Farmers sought to collectively resist the bank and sheriffs who tried to evict them. You have the Farmers Holiday Association created to cut off supplies to urban areas as a result of low prices. Violent labor confrontations occurred at Ford's River Rouge plant and among coal miners in Kentucky. So this is the way many people lived at the beginning of the Depression. And they're called Hoovervilles because they associate this type of living with Hoover, who is often considered a do-nothing president. Again, not wholly accurate. He didn't do nothing. He just didn't do what FDR later comes in and does. In the summer of 1932, you get the bonus army. So you have 15,000 unemployed World War I veterans who traveled to Washington to demand their soldiers' pensions. They were camped near the Capitol building. Hoover called in the U.S. Army to evict them from the land. He already is not very popular, and this cannot withstand the public's anger at the Army injuring veterans and burning their encampment. So basically, they came in asking for their pension that had been promised to them much later, but now they need it, and so they want it. So, yeah, and then he sends the police in on them, basically, or the Army, to get rid of them, and so that's not going to help anything. So in 1932, we get our election of, yes, that man right there on the right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was governor of New York. He was wealthy. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. 1921, he has a polio attack that leaves him wheelchair bound for life. He easily defeats Hoover. So if you can look at this map down here. Oh, I'm just pushing buttons, sorry. If you look at this map down here at the bottom, Hoover is the red. I mean, he still has people who have voted for him. And he does have 40% of the popular vote. But FDR comes in, promises change, and in one of his campaign speeches, he talks about a New Deal. He makes no explanation of what it is or anything, but it's something people think is going to make a change. And so they vote for Roosevelt and elect him. As far as polio tax, so if you see this picture right here where he's photographed from the waist up, I would say probably 90% of the pictures you see of Roosevelt, this is the case. This is a different time. He asked photographers and newspaper people and media people not to photograph him from the waist down. He didn't want the American public to see him in a wheelchair. And if you look at the chair behind him, it is likely a wheelchair. What he did was he had regular chairs fitted with wheels to make them wheelchairs. So again, that public appearance, that he's a confident, strong person and not somebody who's been taken down by disease and can't walk. Let's see. FDR is elected in November of 1932. He takes office in March of 1933 because we do not have the amendment yet with term limits. And we don't have, we don't have the amendment, the 22nd Amendment, which changes, 20th? I'm sorry, it's the 20th Amendment. See? Even I forget stuff. The 20th Amendment, which changes the inauguration date. That doesn't happen till later. So March of 1933. So unemployment grows to 50% in Cleveland, 60% in Akron, 80% in Toledo. And state governors begin temporarily closing banks. So if you've heard the first 100 days, what the president does in the first 100 days, Roosevelt is responsible for that expectation of what a president is going to do in his first 100 days of office. So the day after his inauguration, FDR declares a bank holiday to close all the banks. He passes an emergency banking act calling for the Treasury Department to reopen the banks that had enough reserves to operate in. His first fireside chat, which I'm going to play for you in just a second, FDR reassures Americans that the system would be stable. The Glass-Steagall Act creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which is still in place today, to insure deposits up to $2,500 and prohibited banks from making risky investments. He removes the U.S. Treasury from the gold standard. The Federal Reserve then lowers the interest rates to encourage borrowing. That's what the Fed does when they lower rates. It's to encourage borrowing. So I want to play, oh goodness, I'm just having all kinds of issues this morning. I want to play for you FDR's first fireside chat. It becomes a tradition with him, and he basically talks to the American public on a regular basis and explains to them what's going on in government. And this is the first time anything like this has ever occurred. First off, radio is still fairly new, but it's got to the point where most people have at least one in their homes, so they can hear these things. And this is the President of the United States talking to people like he's sitting in their living room having a conversation. So I'm going to play this first one. It's about 15 minutes. If you were sitting in class and you heard this, or you've heard it before or anything like that, feel free to fast forward the video 15 minutes-ish until it's done. So here we go.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash, except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday, and this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history. The third stage has been the series of regulations permitting the banks to continue their functions to take care of the distribution of food and household necessities and the payment of payroll. This bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. Remember that no sound bank is a dollar worse off than it was when it closed its doors last week. Neither is any bank which may turn out not to be in a position for immediate opening. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. The new currency is being sent out by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in large volume to every part of the country. It is sound currency because it is backed by actual good assets. Another question that you will ask is this: why are all the banks not to be reopened at the same time? The answer is simple, and I know you will understand it. Your government does not intend that the history of the past few years shall be repeated. We do not want and will not have another epidemic of bank failures. As a result, we start tomorrow, Monday, with the opening of banks in the 12 Federal Reserve bank cities. Those banks which on first examination by the Treasury have already been found to be all right. That will be followed on Tuesday by the resumption of all other functions by banks already found to be sound in cities where there are recognized clearinghouses. That means about 250 cities of the United States. In other words, we're moving as fast as the mechanics of the situation will allow. On Wednesday and succeeding days, banks in smaller places all through the country will resume business, subject, of course, to the government's physical ability to complete its survey. It is necessary that the reopening of banks be extended over a period in order to permit the banks to make applications for the necessary loans, to obtain currency needed to meet their requirements, and to enable the government to make common sense checkups. Please let me make it clear to you that if your bank does not open the first day, you are by no means justified in believing that it will not open. A bank that opens on one of the subsequent days is in exactly the same status as the bank that opens tomorrow. I know that many people are worrying about state banks that are not members of the Federal Reserve System. There is no occasion for that worry. These banks can and will receive assistance from member banks and from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And, of course, they are under the immediate control of the state banking authorities. These state banks are following the same course as the national banks, except that they get their licenses to resume business from the state authorities. And these authorities have been asked by the Secretary of the Treasury to permit their good banks to open up on the same schedule as the national banks. And so I am confident that the state banking departments will be as careful as the national government in the policy relating to the opening of banks and will follow the same broad theory. It is possible that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear to you that the banks will take care of all needs, except, of course, the hysterical demands of hoarders, and it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime in every part of our nation. It needs no prophet to tell you that when the people find that they can get their money, that they can get it when they want it for all legitimate purposes, the phantom of fear will soon be laid. People will again be glad to have their money where it will be safely taken care of, and where they can use it conveniently at any time. I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress. The success of our whole national program depends, of course, on the cooperation of the public, on its intelligent support, and its use of a reliable system. Remember that the essential accomplishment of the new legislation is that it makes it possible for banks more readily to convert their assets into cash than was the case before. More liberal provision has been made for banks to borrow on these assets at the reserve banks, and more liberal provision has also been made for issuing currency on the security of these good assets. This currency is not fiat currency. It is issued only on adequate security, and every good bank has an abundance of such security. One more point before I close. There will be, of course, some banks unable to reopen without being reorganized. The new law allows the government to assist in making these reorganizations quickly and effectively, and even allows the government to subscribe to at least a part of any new capital that may be required. I hope you can see, my friends, from this essential recital of what your government is doing, that there is nothing complex, nothing radical in the process. We have had a bad banking situation. Some of our bankers have shown themselves either incompetent or dishonest in their handling of the people's funds. They had used the money entrusted to them in speculations and unwise loans. This was, of course, not true in the vast majority of our banks, but it was true in enough of them to shock the people of the United States for a time into a sense of insecurity and to put them into a frame of mind where they did not differentiate, but seemed to assume that the acts of a comparative few had tainted them all. And so it became the government's job to straighten out this situation and to do it as quickly as possible, and that job is being performed. I do not promise you that every bank will be reopened, or that individual losses will not be suffered, but there will be no losses that possibly could be avoided, and there would have been more and greater losses had we continued to drift. I can even promise you salvation for some at least of the sorely pressed banks. We shall be engaged not merely in reopening sound banks, but in the creation of more sound banks through reorganization. It has been wonderful to me to catch the note of confidence from all over the country. I can never be sufficiently grateful to the people for the loyal support that they have given me in their acceptance of the judgment that has dictated our course, even though all our processes may not have seemed clear to them. After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plans. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friend. Your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
All right, so FDR, if you paid attention, you kind of saw the manner in which he spoke to people. He explained, he told people why he was doing what he was doing. We haven't really had a president like that since, but very unique president. All right, so let's move on. Agricultural and manufacturing. So you have the Agriculture Adjustment Act, or the AAA, direct governmental regulation of the farm economy, provided subsidies to farmers to cut production so that prices would rise, so wheat, cotton, corn, hogs, rice, tobacco, dairy. The money mostly helped those with large farms, not sharecroppers. So basically they were paid not to work. National Industrial Recovery Act established the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, to create self-governing private associations in 600 industries. You have unemployment relief. So Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, led by Harry Hopkins, avoided direct payouts or a dole and instead put people to work in the Public Works Administration, Civil Works Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. As far as the housing crisis, homeowner loans corporation, the HOLC, created to refinance mortgages. The Housing Act of 1937 changes the mortgage system. All right, so anytime you have something new, you're going to have people who are against it or going to criticize it. So a couple of our critics on the right, you have Republicans that created the Liberty League with conservative Democrats to fight the New Deal. Creation of the National Association of Manufacturers produced radio, pictures, billboards, and direct mailing to promote free enterprise. 1935, you have Schechter versus the United States. It ruled the NIRA unconstitutional because it gave legislative powers to the executive. The Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Railroad Retirement Act, and debt relief efforts. As far as critics on the populist left, you have Dr. Francis Townsend. That is the guy on the left there, argued for an old age revolving pension plan of $200 a month to people over 60 who did not work. Father Charles Coughlin, a Detroit priest, organized the National Union for Social Justice and took his argument that the New Deal was not doing enough to the radio. Senator Huey Long becomes critical of the New Deal in 1934 and creates the Share Our Wealth Society to argue for the equal distribution of wealth and 100% tax on all income over $1 million. That's a little insane. Nobody should have to give all their money to the government. Anyway, Roosevelt, there was a lot of critics. He wasn't really worried about the small minorities, but these ones who talk a lot and incite people and that kind of stuff, those are the people he wants to kind of placate. So he does come up with some things. The Wagner Act and Social Security. So FDR moves a little left to combat critics. The NIRA, Section 7A, gave workers the right to unionize. It is voided by the Supreme Court in 1935. There's new legislation proposed by Senator Robert Wagner, upheld workers' rights to join unions. It outlawed industry's ability to fire workers for organizing and suppressing unions, created the National Labor Relations Board to protect workers and guarantee the right of collective bargaining. You have the Social Security Act of 1935, old age pension, federal state system of compensation for the unemployed, payments to widowed mothers of blind, deaf, and disabled. And you have the New Dealism to preserve individual liberty. Government must assist the needy and guarantee the people's basic welfare. All right, 1936 election. The Work Progress Administration puts 8.5 million people to work on construction and repair of roads, bridges, public buildings, parks, and airports. New voters were energized by the Democratic Party under FDR. The party was able to attract voters from the North, the Midwest, organized labor, white ethnic groups, Northern blacks, the middle class, and many Southerners. FDR asked for changes to the Supreme Court. He wants to add a new member for every court member over the age of 70. This is called the court packing plan. Probably one of the biggest stains on FDR's record. People fear that the president wants to pack the court with supporters. The effort does fail, but FDR does to get to make appointments with subsequent requirements. Roosevelt recession in 1937 and 1938 dealt a blow to FDR, who increased spending to get out of the recession. All right. As far as organized labor, increased numbers and political power, Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, brought together all workers in an industry. Generally enhanced women's welfare, but not directly, the New Deal. You have Frances Perkins, who is the first woman named to a cabinet post. That's her standing there by that fire escape. Interesting story about her. She actually witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and it was with that led her to her life of public service and wanting to do better for women. She was Secretary of Labor. Eleanor Roosevelt had a high-profile position in the White House as the conscience of the New Deal. You'll hear a lot about the relationship between FDR and Eleanor, but he did value her opinion, as she did a lot for women's rights during her term as First Lady. FDR was extremely popular among African Americans, but does little to aid them directly. You have the CCC camps, the concentration Corps, the work camps, the camps for people to work were segregated. Social Security and the Wagner Act excluded domestic and agricultural African American workers. There are no federal anti-lynching laws. The Scottsboro Boys case reveals how unfair the Southern justice system was to African Americans. Southern Democrats controlled the states where most blacks lived. And we'll keep talking more about that. As far as the Indian policy, John Collier, who's head of the Indian Bureau's affair, pushed through the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. It's sometimes called the Indian New Deal. It reversed the Dawes Act, gave Indians increased religious freedom and more power to tribal governments. Government still financially controlled the reservations. Struggles in the West, so government promotes repatriation of Mexicans, basically deporting Mexicans from the United States back to Mexico. About 60% of them were U.S. citizens. It was one of the things that they used to try to get people out and allow other people to be working. Others leave voluntarily. In California, Mexican-American movement, the MAM, was organized with help from New Deal funds. Discrimination against Asians and Asian Americans worsens with the economic downturn, and many were ineligible for citizenship and aid. All right, the Dust Bowl. A severe drought on the Great Plains between 1930 and 1941. Over 350,000 Okies, or people from Oklahoma, sought to leave the region for California. Soil Conservation Service tried to work with farmers to prevent future soil erosion by not producing certain crops and planting certain grasses. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was started in 1933. It integrated flood control, reforestation, electricity generation, and agricultural and industrial development. Still in effect today, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Rural Electrification Administration helped bring electricity to the region with loans to farmers. And lastly, the Grand Coulee Dam was built on the Columbia River in Washington State, the largest electricity producing structure in the world. And actually, if you look up in that top right-hand corner, the man on the little pipe, the Cooley Dam was the largest federally funded project in the West, and at its completion in 1941, the largest electricity-producing structure in the world. By focusing on the man in the conduit and the three men on top, the photographer illustrates the project's large scale very effectively. This is another very popular photograph from the Depression era. It's taken by Dorothea Lange. The setting is a pea picker's camp in California, and of course you have the woman from migrant farm working families surrounded by her children. They look poor, tired, dirty, and likely hungry. The image attests to the sheer sense of loss and disillusion Americans felt during this period. It is called The Migrant Mother. You can see the desperation in her eyes as her children lean against her shoulder, shielding theirs. All right. All right, last one. New Deal in the arts. So there are federal art projects. Art for the Millions provided work for artists such as Jackson Pollock, Alice Neal, William de Kooning, among others. You have the Federal Music Project and Federal Writers Project further employed musicians and writers. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. Fabulous book, I think I've told you that before. And Richard Wright's Native Son were both supported by these programs. As far as the Federal Theater Project goes, encouraged talented directors, actors, and playwrights, Orson Welles, John Huston, or Houston maybe, and Arthur Miller of The Crucible. Heard of Arthur Miller before. So there was a lot of things. People were paid to do whatever they could figure out to get people to do. Works projects, art projects, theater projects, building projects, so many things. First time in our history where the government is so involved in people's everyday lives. So that is all I have for right now. I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will speak to you or see you very soon. Have a great day.